Ladies and gentlemen, today I will be going on AskReddit, and we're going to be looking at the most overhyped jobs. The topic is, what is one profession that you think is the most overhyped? So let's get into it. As a graphic designer, I say graphic design. I thought it was the cool profession that everyone else envied. Instead, you get 10 different people telling you how everything should look, while other departments act like you don't contribute anything to the company. Plus now, thanks to sites like Canva, everyone thinks they are a designer, and don't even get me started on what AI is doing to the profession. There is a trick to this that experienced graphic designers all do: add an obvious flaw to the design, one that the customer will undoubtedly identify and point out. When they do, compliment them on having such a good sense of artistic design and say it'll take some hard work for you to get it fixed. In reality, the final unflawed design is already completed and you just wait a few days to show it off. Now, that is a genius idea. I've done graphic design for a few people before, and it is annoying whenever people come back with notes, but this trick is amazing. If I still did graphic design, I would have love to have that as an option. But I am friends with some graphic designers. Some of them do freelance, but a few of them are signed to companies, to corporations, and basically they're always just being given a bunch of different work to do, not because there's work that needs to be done, but just because they're a full-time employee and the boss is like, all right, if you're going to be here and we're going to pay you, we're just going to have you, constantly do stuff. So that way, we're getting our money's worth for hiring you. From what I understand though, from one of my friends, he went to school for package design. So he's a graphic designer specifically for packages, and apparently, at least according to him, he's my only source for that. But package design is like what you want to get into if you want to make a lot of money and have like, I guess, a secure job. Because like I guess a lot of other graphic designers, it's just one-off things. They need a logo or whatever they require from you, and then that's it. That's done for the job. But as a package designer, a lot of companies, depending on what you're working with, whether it's a beverage company or, something in food, or even aside from food and beverage, there's so many things that need package design. And usually a lot of them come out with different flavors and seasonal items. So if you're doing that, you're always going to have some sort of work, at least from what I understand from his perspective. So that's some advice if you're trying to become a graphic designer. Let's move on to the next one. The next one is social media influencers, and then someone went on to reply, is that even a profession? And you know what, I'm a social media influencer, although I hate the word influencer so much. I prefer content creator or YouTuber, because influencer, in my opinion, is someone who is just like talking to the camera, but not even like creating anything. They're just like, hey, today I went and got a coffee, and then I saw someone walk by. Like, I don't even know what they're possibly talking about. Usually it's just like really attractive men and women who have an influence because they're attractive or because they're like the popular person. I guess maybe I'm not considered an influencer, even though I'm just reading off of Reddit right now and adding my own responses to it. So I'm not really creating much right now, but I like to imagine that on my regular content, my animations, I'm creating something. So if this applies to me, if social media influencers is talking about everyone who's doing social media and making money, then you know what? It is pretty overhyped. It is hard to make a living out of it. So I think that might be what the overhyped part that they're talking about is. But a lot of those people do very little work and just make a lot of money. So I would think it's pretty underhyped if you're like a hot person that's just making money for being hot. But yeah, let's move on. We got a long one here. So anything video game related. Want to be a game developer? Congrats. You're signing yourself up to work horrible hours with zero job security for pennies on the dollar versus what you could make in a similar non-gaming profession. Having your name in a game credit will mean very little to you when your children don't even recognize it as it scrolls past the credit scene that they skipped away. Get sponsored by an esports team? Awesome. Welcome to 12 hours of practice per day of the same game that you will very quickly start to hate as it consumes your life. Enjoy constantly competing against thousands of younger players from the other side of the world who are just as good as you and willing to work for less pay and benefits. Don't worry that you're building a career in an environment where being over 30 is considered ancient, or that you aren't developing a single skill that will be marketable once your short career is up. Are you a humble soul who just wants to test video games for a living? Let me introduce the absolute nightmare that is software QA, where you're once again paid basically nothing to repeatedly test the same tiny little piece of the game over and over to try to find bugs that half the time won't even be fixed on release. You never once getting to actually play the game as it was intended or experience the story, instead jumping at the same blank wall to check to make sure the overworked developer didn't leave a gap in the mesh when they programmed it. Also, this is an intermediate build, so none of the animations have been implemented and all the NPCs are T-posing. Stay the hell away from the video game industry. It's oversaturated and rife with abuse. Now, we have three different things basically here. Although game developer and software QA is kind of in the similar area, is similar industry, but let's break each of these down. So the first one is being a game developer. Usually that means being a programmer, although I don't know if game design also can fall under that category, but let's just think of a programmer, someone who's programming, coding a game, and yeah, they do work terrible hours, at least most of the time. From what I've heard, if you're working for a AAA company, you're getting extremely overworked, and the whole appeal is that, you get to work for this company, so you should appreciate it, and it's a company that you might have been a fan of. And then if you're working for a small indie game studio, usually that's more of like a passion thing, where it's you want to make good video games, you don't want to make like some sort of cash grab game, but at the same time you can't get paid much because it's a small studio. There's only so much of a budget that they can afford to pay you. So usually in both of those cases, you are not earning much money and you are working a lot of hours, depending on what the studio is. But there are other areas where I've heard aren't that bad. Like one example I've heard is working for Amazon Gaming, at least from what I saw on Pirate Software's video, where he spoke about that, where compared to Blizzard, he was working less hours and I guess not having to do as much strenuous work. It was I wouldn't say easier, but much more manageable, I guess the word would be. Also, I've heard from like a friend of a friend that working for like a kids TV channel that is making games based on the characters, like flash games, like interactive games you can play on browser, those people are usually paid a good amount of money, and they work their 40 hours a week or whatever it is, and then that's it. There's not like a crazy crunch overtime because you're not trying to get a game out in time, for whatever the deadline is for like a AAA title. It's just, we're making these browser games or whatever it is just so people can connect more with the show. So yeah, that's the game developer part. I do agree that it is overhyped. Even I've heard like mobile game development, which is like, the games are much smaller, but you're still, I guess, being crunched to a certain degree. But a lot of those development jobs for mobile games are usually like outsourced overseas where it's a lot cheaper. But yeah, let's move on to the esports team. And yeah, I mean, from what I understand, they do work 12 hours a day, probably even more. They're just constantly practicing with the team, trying to figure out different strategies. And I guess you could compare it to a sport where, if you're a basketball player or a baseball player, you need to put in just as much work. I mean, I don't know if you guys have seen Brock Lesnar's workout, but he's working out strenuously for 8 hours a day, if not more. He's swimming, he's weightlifting, he's doing all these things. So I don't know if it's really overhyped because, you're still trained. It's the same way, an athlete would train. They're doing the same thing over and over again to get those skills down. So I wouldn't say it's overhyped in that way, but I do believe that they get paid way less. A lot of the money comes from prizes or just investors' money, which can only go so far. So from what I've seen online, if you're an esports player and you're not like winning, the grand championship of whatever game you're playing, you're really not making much money. The only reason you're surviving is because your housing is paid for. You live with your team in a house, and then also you get free meals. But aside from that, there's really not much extra money for you to like be able to save up and retire with, unless you're constantly winning, the tournaments. And if you're not doing that, then yeah, I guess by the time you're 30 and I guess you're a washed up esports player, you don't really have much money left and you don't really have the skills to keep up with, these 12-year-olds that are building Fortnite bunkers in 5 seconds. You can't really keep up. So I do agree that an esports team player is probably very overhyped. Now, last is a QA tester. They mentioned software QA, but yeah, there's QA for a lot of different things. I had a friend that was a QA tester for like a lottery site or something, and he hated that job because you're constantly trying to check how to break it so that way you can go back to the developer who, as they said here, is very tired, overworked, and you're just trying to, I guess, completely destroy what they've built so that way it's unbreakable. And yeah, also you don't get to enjoy the experience because you're just like, all right, let's figure out how to play this game in the least effective way as possible so that way we can see what's broken or what should be fixed. And yeah, it doesn't seem like a fun job because in your mind you're like, okay, I'm just playing video games. I'm sure there's only like one time where you take the path that the developer intended, but most of the time, you're being put in a level and you just have to keep trying different things. You have to see like, all right, if I jump and run at the same time, like, is that going to work or is that going to break the game? If I'm like standing over a rock and running in circles, like, what is that going to do? So I definitely agree that it's overhyped. And also those jobs pay very little because they're like, we can get anyone to do that. For the most part, you should understand how, I guess, development works, but for the most part, that is a job where people are like, oh, I gotta play video games for a living, I would love to do that. So they pay very little because they know that there's such a demand for that job. So yeah, the video game industry, probably should stay away from it if you're a programmer. If you want to be a programmer and you're like, oh, I love making games, I feel like the best case scenario for you, at least also from my experience, because I do make games. I've made a lot of video games as a hobby, and also at a certain point in time I was making mobile games and I was releasing those on my own. I wasn't working for a company. I was just making mobile games and putting them out on the App Store. And I feel like if you want to get into game development but you are a programmer, your best case scenario is probably just to work for a regular software company or some sort of company that is not gaming related, and then do game development as a hobby. So that way you can make what you're passionate about, because if you're working for a company, you don't get creative control. You have to fit within their guidelines, what they're trying to make money from, because a lot of them, the whole point of their game is to make money. Like a lot of the time, it's really not to have a fun experience. The fun aspect comes second. Above all, they just want to make a shit ton of money, especially like sports games and a lot of these MMOs. They want to make a lot of money, especially to keep up servers and whatever else is required from a multiplayer game. So yeah, long story short, get a regular programming job and then do game dev as a hobby on the side if you really want to make games. Although I guess on the other token, there's a couple people that said software dev. There's a couple people that are talking about regular programming. This one person said software dev. People think we do some kind of crazy shit and I'm here staring at code barely knowing what I'm doing half the time. And someone replied saying the key isn't to know what to do, it's to Google search what you need to do effectively. Thank you, underemployed Indian YouTuber. You've saved my ass multiple times. And someone else said software engineer. So many people think they can write code just because they know how to hack HTML. And yeah, a lot of people who are programmers really don't know how to code. I went to school for programming. I never got my bachelor's degree, but I remember in my programming classes, a lot of these kids not only didn't know how to program, which I thought was weird because I felt like before getting into computer science, you would want to know how to program, or you would have been doing it beforehand. Like I started programming in junior year of high school, and that's the reason I wanted to get into computer science, not because I was going to go to school to learn it, just because I already knew programming and I was like, all right, let's see what more I can learn, or just get this degree so I can get a job. But there's so many kids that I was in class with that didn't know what was going on, and I'm sure after they graduated they still really didn't know how to program, and I don't think they really cared. They just wanted to get a job and then I guess figure it out from there. They really weren't passionate about programming. They were just like, okay, this is going to get me a lot of money from what I've heard. But even if you are passionate about programming, that doesn't mean you are going to be the best at it. There's so many people that are going to be better than you, and honestly, Google is a great resource. Looking up stuff online on Stack Overflow is going to be very helpful, and it's really not cheating, because I've always thought for the longest time, I was like, if I'm looking up stuff online, that means I don't know it. But it's really not true, because you might know it but just need a refresher or something, because there's only so much your brain can remember, and looking through the documentation is really not cheating. And I started to realize that once I started listening to some podcasts about programmers that were talking about how 90% of development is literally just looking stuff online and then copy and pasting that, because there's always going to be someone smarter than you, and really your job is just to problem solve. I think that's the most important skill that a programmer can have. It's problem solving. It's getting this project or this problem and you need to solve it, and you're going to use whatever resources are available for you to solve it, whether that's looking through the documentation, whether that's looking online and asking questions in forums. Whatever you need to do, you just need to get it done, and that doesn't always require you knowing every single thing off the top of your head. But I guess it falls under the overhype because people think they're geniuses, and in actuality, if somebody else spent the same amount of time, they could have easily learned the same skills that they have. And they could easily learn how to Google stuff. Now, to end it all, we're gonna go with this guy who said YouTuber. It's extremely high pressure unless you have an alternate platform or sponsors as a backup. YouTube pushes and incentivizes the wrong things while also being a very dangerous platform to trust your career and livelihood on. And I agree with that 100%. It is very overhyped to be a full-time YouTuber. And it's not really just YouTuber. I think it's just any sort of entertainment industry. The people that are able to consistently do this full-time and have employees are really like the top 1%. And everyone else is just like, all right, I could be a full-time YouTuber for a year and then, not be anymore. And then maybe for the next 2 years be full-time again. And the ultimate goal is to eventually reach a point where you're always full-time, but you never really know what's going to happen, because at the end of the day, it's not a job, it's a business. And any sort of business you're running, you don't know what's going to happen. Whether that's a restaurant or you own like a computer repair store or just any sort of business, you really don't know what's going to happen. There's stuff that is always changing, algorithms changing, what people want is changing, the market is always changing, and you need to learn how to adapt. And yeah, so YouTuber just falls under that, because at the end of the day, you are running a business whether you want to believe that or not, because you might be like, oh, I'm an artist. I don't want this to be a business thing. I want this to be, I'm making art for a living, but you really just have to be a business. And when things fall apart, you just have to remember at the end of the day, you're a business owner and you got to figure out a game plan so that way you are able to keep doing it full time. So I'm going to end the video here. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you want more content like this. I really enjoyed making it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. And as always, have a great fucking day.